Hello, everyone. I hope you're well. Welcome to today's conversation with Matt Segal. Matt is an assistant professor in the Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness program at the California Institute of Integral Studies, that's based in California. So you can find all of Matt's work in the description, which I will link for his books, but also his website, Footnotes to Plato, which I highly recommend if you enjoy this conversation. Matt writes on a variety of topics, but as you'll see in this conversation, Matt's heavily influenced and been inspired by Alfred North Whitehead and Goethe as well. And this conversation really considers what Alfred North Whitehead's philosophy and worldview can offer us and help us make sense out of perhaps certain quagmires we find ourselves in with, say, scientific materialism and model-centric sort of ontologies, um, and ranging from psychology to biology. And that sort of brings in Goethe's work and Goethe's scientific methodologies, which perhaps have been forgotten or were never really picked up and never really took on. Whereas Matt talks about how increasingly they are, and this is the idea of the fact that the archetypes can manifest in the particular in a sense, in an Aristotelian way. So there are archetypes, and the archetypes manifest themselves in the particular, yet certain conditions can, how would you say, occlude the archetypes from manifesting. And so it is our job as beings or scientific beings, if we're trying to make sense out of reality and encounter it, it is to await really and sort of allow nature to presence itself. Whereas and Goethe was critical of this, model centric scientific ontologies postulate hypotheses. And as soon as there is sufficient data to affirm that hypothesis, we essentially give nature a taxonomy which perhaps it doesn't need, and in sense sort of omit data from manifesting itself. Anyway, listen to the conversation if you're interested, and I hope you enjoy it and have a lovely day. Who was the first, do you recall the first sort of philosopher or philosophy book which really sort of grabbed your attention?
Yep, another Brit actually. It was Alan Watts,
Okay, yeah.
and the book was called The Book. The Book on the Taboo Against Knowing Who You Are is the full
Right.
title. And my high school psychology teacher, Mr. Ennis, recommended that to me as a high school junior, I guess. And it's a short little book. It's written in a simple way, but quite mind-bending. And it clued me into the fact that philosophy could be not just an interesting intellectual exercise, but a kind of spiritual path and deeply transformative of one's outlook on life. So I was hooked after that.
Yeah, and what you say there makes a lot of sense given what having read your work and what your writings, or footnotes to Plato about this idea of, I suppose, because my next question was going to be how do you see the role of philosophy? But I think you sort of alluded to it there, which is it can be a sort of transformative for oneself, but then in turn, I suppose, the world, because we are in connection with the world. Um, and is that, yeah, so I suppose, is that how you see philosophy? And also, because there are, for example, Hegel, I think, he had that quote, didn't he, referring to the owl of Minerva, which I believe was essentially, he was positing that philosophy comes quite late to the party, and it actually doesn't necessarily have much influence on the outcome of things. Right.
Right.
Is that your take on it? Is that what he was getting at?
That's what Hegel means when he says the
Yeah.
owl of Minerva flies at dusk. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
Philosophy, wisdom, the owl of Minerva represents wisdom, and that this understanding of history, Hegel's point was, always occurs in retrospect, and that the role of the philosopher is not to instigate revolutions. That would be Marx turning Hegel upside down, um, but rather
Yes.
to to interpret history. I think Whitehead, though, would want to give philosophy a more active role to play in shaping civilization, even if even if it's not as quick as we would like, and as powerful a force as we might like. Nonetheless, over centuries, the ideas entertained by philosophers and given articulation and expression by philosophers, Whitehead would say, do shape the course
Mm,
of society and culture and the values of our civilization. So I don't
mm.
I don't fully I know I get why Hegel would say what he says. It's not that it's simply false, but I think it's also true that philosophy can play a positive role in shaping the future.
Yes, yes. And so I thought, yeah, it'd be nice to kind of, if it's okay with you, to sort of elaborate or sort of elucidate perhaps Whitehead's system or ontology broadly, and perhaps referring to the general, terminology as it helps make sense out of that framework. And but particularly with regards to, or rather, what that was in response to, perhaps what he was responding to in a sense. Maybe many things, but for example, one of them, which I know you've written about, is like this idea of like the bifurcation of nature. Um, but then
Right.
also, which I've enjoyed reading your work on, is your sort of, perhaps critiques of the current zeitgeist, maybe both in physics and cognitive sciences, for example, predictive processing. Not throwing them all out completely. Not saying predictive processing has no. You've been clear on that. But perhaps where it sort of falls short, or why it perhaps can't quite. mm, yeah, explain certain phenomena, perhaps things like feeling, and for example, I think you've critiqued, the kind of idea of like, but yeah, well, before we get onto that, but anyway, yeah. So what was Whitehead responding to, and how does this kind of philosophy of organism differ perhaps to previous ontologies?
Yeah. So, I mean, interestingly, predictive processing models of human neurology and neurophysiology, Helmholtz developed that in the second half of the 19th century, so it's quite an old approach that's been dusted off and advanced more recently. And so in some ways, Whitehead was already responding to that. Um, these advances in physiology in the second half of the 19th century, but also the revolutions in physics, both relativity and quantum theory in the first part of the 20th century, really demolished the old mechanistic materialist metaphysics that had undergirded physical science, physics since Descartes and Newton. Um, and Whitehead was well prepared to understand the significance of those scientific revolutions and paradigm changes because he was a mathematician and very interested in applied mathematics in particular, and um, was one of the few mathematicians alive, I think, in the 19 teens who could actually understand what Einstein was proposing, um, because he had already done some work on non-Euclidean geometries and whatnot. And so Whitehead realized that these new approaches in physics required a new metaphysical background. The old mechanistic picture was entirely inadequate for accounting for the relativity of space and time. Absolute space is out the window. So there's no longer this empty container through which simply located material particles could, traverse distances. And so he set to work um, developing this more organic conception of the universe where what there are not these inert solid particles that exist entirely independently of one another and that can be whose location can be defined independently of their relationships to any other particles, but rather what finally exists for Whitehead are events, and an event's location can only be defined by reference to the other events in its community. And so it's a kind of network ontology of events or occasions, actual occasions, as he would later call them. And this picture of a process ontology or a process relational ontology helped him make sense of what physics was saying, but then there's also biology, and there's also evolutionary theory, and there's also human consciousness. And so, how do we integrate the fact that we are conscious organisms that have emerged over the course of billions of years of evolution with this picture of the physical world? And so, what he ends up doing is generalizing the idea of organism beyond just biology so that it includes any self organizing entity. And so, he'll say, physics is the study of the smaller organisms, like protons and electrons and hydrogen atoms. And biology is the study of the larger organisms. And you could say astrophysics is the study of the even larger organisms, like stars and galaxies and so on. All of these are self-organizing systems. And in Whitehead's view, just like us and other life forms, there's some kind of interior experience. There's a way in which the universe is not just like lights out a bunch of events occurring with nobody to experience them, but there's actually subjectivity is pervasive at every scale in the universe to different degrees, but nonetheless, for Whitehead, even a photon is the expression of some kind of enjoyment, would be the word he would use. It's entertaining. There's an entertainment of the process through which it is going through, even for a photon or an electron. Um, so it's a pretty radical idea, but if we're going to have a comprehensive cosmology within which all of our knowledge and experience finds its place, it seems to me that we're going to end up with something like what Whitehead proposed, even if, we might, want to um, figure out some details that don't quite fit together. I mean, we're never going to be finished trying to understand the universe, but I think we can do better
Mm,
or worse. And Whitehead seems to me to have done a pretty good job, including almost everything.
yeah. Yeah, and yeah, so you mentioned there the actual occasions or sort of these events, and I believe so. There's two terms which essentially, so yeah, there's these at these sort of smaller scales, and then occasions happen at smaller scales, and then I suppose as they, I don't know how you'd say, conglomerate or accrue or build up over maybe and sort of ascend through some sort of like as occasions become like meet occasions and occasions, essentially we become eventually, you go through atoms to beings like us, albeit like you said, all the way through that there is some element of enjoyment or sort of maybe sentience, not consciousness necessarily, because I know that you've spoken about this, and I think it was you, and referring to
Hmm.
Whitehead, that it's not necessarily consciousness as we see consciousness typically or how we experience, but some sort of feeling,
Right.
and that and then we're a society of actual entities, so meaning that we're essentially a collection of, and that's happened through consecration. So essentially what's consecrescence, if that's I've pronounced that right in Whitehead's ontology,
Concrescence. Hmm.
what
Concrescence.
concrescence, and then
Mhm.
also prehension. So essentially how is it, yeah, that what's the developmental or the sort of that this becoming, how does that take place through prehension, and that other word that you've just pronounced?
Yeah.
Right,
Whitehead has lots of words that he invents. Actually, concrescence is a Latin word that he reappropriates. It means
right,
growing. It just means growing together.
right.
Um, and so it's a term that he uses to explain the process whereby a new event or occasion of experience arises out of its past and achieves a new perspective in the present, and then perishes to become food, as it were, for the next round of concrescence, which will, yeah, like eat this prior concrescence, digest it, make it its own. But there's a transference
Mm,
of feeling and value which occurs with each concrescence as it arises out of its past, achieves a novel perspective in the present, and then perishes into the future, like giving itself to the next round of concrescence. And as a result of these cyclical processes of concrescence, there's a kind of accumulation which occurs, as you were saying, that gives rise to what we normally experienced, enduring bodies, our own bodies, all the plants and animals around us, stars, galaxies. Um, these are actually what Whitehead calls societies of actual occasions, which is to say, um, our body maintains its form moment by moment because there are innumerable actual occasions inheriting the past, uh, repeating it in some large degree in the present, but with a little bit of
Mm,
novelty mixed in, and then handing that off to the next round of concrescence. And so there's a certain form or characteristic that's repeated reliably that allows you to recognize me in, as time unfolds. And I am at the molecular level, I am changing a lot.
mm,
Molecules are entering and leaving my body. And if we're going to be fussily exact, there's no sharp line that divides my body from the environment. But
mm,
nonetheless, there are certain characteristics that are maintained by the repetitiveness of some actual occasions, moment by moment, that compose my body. But there's also some degree of um, novelty, moment by moment. But think of our bodies as a society of societies, and some
mm.
societies are nested within the brain and the nervous system.
Sure.
And in that context, Whitehead would say, because of how well organized the body is, billions of years of evolution, our brain is able to shelter a higher intensity of experience and even consciousness that can, in his terms, ingress or prehend or feel more possibilities moment by moment than, say, the actual occasions that compose my fingernail, which are just very
Right.
repetitive, or
Right.
that compose the desk, or my coffee mug. There's not as much novelty moment by moment in the case of inanimate objects. It's just repetition. Whereas in the case of
Right.
living organisms, there's more possibility being felt by the actual occasions that compose me. And so what we feel at the level of our own consciousness is a expression and emergence out of all of this activity. Whitehead would say our consciousness is a very high grade form of the feeling or the prehension going on, um, among all of these, innumerable actual occasions. And so, like you were saying, he's not suggesting that a photon is conscious, but he is suggesting that there's a kind of gradient, from a
Mm,
very small amount of feeling up to self-reflexive consciousness,
yes.
and there's never a 0 point of experience.
And yeah. And is that also, does that make sense, or in the context of what I think he spoke about, or I don't know if he actually used the term, or you have just in writing upon, because I've not read any of Whitehead's work directly. All I've encountered is through other authors such as yourself, primarily yourself, and actually a little bit of Peter S. Hughes as well. Um, but this term, the critique of pure feeling, and essentially what you've just said there about these actual occasions and how they consecrate and
Consecrate's a good word for it too.
yeah, you know what, I'm always getting taken the mick out of. I always have my own strange way of pronouncing words, so it's nothing new. But yeah, um but essentially what this does, well, what he's doing is, how would you say, articulating an account for the necessary conditions to explain us and how we are these conscious moral, or I don't know about moral, but conscious beings. And that's essentially
Mhm.
what his ontology does. It provisions the kind of conditions to, in the same way that Kant provision the conditions for us to be rational beings that can make sense out of the sensorium.
Yeah, no, definitely. There is an analogy there with Kant and his transcendental philosophy, trying to provide the conditions for the possibility of our conscious experience. But with Whitehead, you know, in, in contrast to Kant, looking for who's developing a critique of pure reason, Whitehead is developing a critique of feeling. And so
Mm,
instead of uh, sort of anchoring all of our experience on a hierarchy of categories, as Kant does, Whitehead anchors our experience in this hierarchy of feelings. And so it's an aesthetic ontology rather than a, say, cognitive ontology, if Kant even has an ontology. Really, he's more, making epistemology first
That's
philosophy,
a
and
that's a
yeah,
really interesting point you've made there. Yeah, because I thought that I'm not, I'm nowhere near a philosophical scholar, and I have never read Kant, in it really directly. But that's something because people talk about him like this idea of his like transcendental idealism, but he never really. It's not a full ontology because he never actually speaks to what's beyond the mind. He just talking
yeah,
about the conditions that are required enough in order for us to make sense out of something.
that's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so for Kant, the mind, the human mind, and its activity of reflecting upon concepts and our sensory organization is something that we can know and understand. We can know how we know,
Mm,
but we can't know what's beyond our uh, sensory experience of the
sure.
world, right? And so whatever might be causing our sensory experience, the real world out there. Kant didn't deny that there is a real world of
Yeah.
things in themselves out there, but he said we can't know a damn thing about them.
Yeah.
And so what Whitehead does is say, uh, well, why do we need to put the human mind at the center of everything? The human mind obviously came from somewhere. It evolved. It emerged out of this real world. And so, for Whitehead, instead of saying, oh, what are the um, transcendental, sort of logical conditions that make our experience possible? What are the set of categories that we could enumerate that would explain how we, determine every object in our experience? But rather, Whitehead says, what are the cosmological conditions of our human conscious experience? And so he's starting with our sense of conscious agency as human beings, and he's sort of distilling it down to its simplest possible form, right? Which would be something like an actual occasion of experience. And he's boiled off, all of these higher grade, more complex forms of consciousness and um, self-reflection and all of that, and just gotten to the bare minimum form of subjectivity and says that's what is cosmically basic, right? And everything else arises out of reorganizations of this basic form of feeling or prehension or experience, right? And so it's
Mm,
similar to Kant, looking for the conditions of possibility, but almost turned inside out, right? Whitehead
mm,
wants to begin with the real universe, whereas Kant is beginning with our ideal reflection upon a phenomenal world, and we don't know what's
mm.
behind that phenomenal
Yeah.
screen.
Right. And you, Matt, I believe have um, spoken about this idea of I can't remember the second term, but it begins the descendental something. How is
Yeah,
it? Does this relate to this?
it does exactly. Yeah, so descendental as the opposite of transcendental is this
Mm,
movement sort of down through our bodily feeling back into the cosmos,
right.
in search of the conditions for the possibility of our conscious experience, rather than uh, with Kant starting from the most abstract and the most removed from the body and from the world, and trying
Yeah.
to derive the world from that, or
Yeah.
derive our consciousness from that. So, descendental is a term I borrow from the German idealist Friedrich Schelling, who
Yeah.
who was doing his work a few decades after Kant, um, wrote his critiques and both inherits but also transforms Kant's critiques in a way very similar to Whitehead.
Mm,
I think of Schelling as an early progenitor of process philosophy, a proto process philosopher.
right. Okay.
Mm.
Yeah, because I haven't read as much. A number of months ago, I read a couple of yeah, I guess articles, maybe 4 or 5 months ago now, so I can't really remember it, but I remember it being around Schelling, and it's clear that yeah, Schelling's had quite an influence on you. My understanding with Schelling, and maybe it's misunderstanding, he was almost like a sort of an absolute. Was he an absolute idealist in this, or was he not?
Uh, so he, along with um, uh, Fichte and Hegel were
Mm.
developing what you could call absolute idealism, but they each
Mm.
had their own flavor of
Yeah.
that. And Schelling was more interested in the philosophy of nature and
Mm.
wanted to understand, similar to Whitehead again, how, rather than trying to put mind at the center of everything and describe nature as a kind of appearance to mind,
Mm.
Schelling wanted to say, well, what if nature is this real creative power and that mind emerges out of it? Um,
Right.
right. So he would ask instead of Kant's question, what is the mind such that nature can appear to us in the way that it does?
Mm.
Schelling would ask, what is nature such that mind could have emerged out of it? Right.
Yeah.
And his answer is, well, it must be some kind of a living, organic, creative process.
Right. Yeah.
Mhm.
Oh, yeah, yeah, makes sense. And then coming back to the sort of how it juxtaposes against the sort of Kantian tradition, and which maybe, for example, we see, which I know you've written, which I've read some of your writings on around, which is, I suppose, what inherit from that Kantian, for example, things like predictive processing, which, but to be honest, maybe it's just the kind of the zeitgeist more generally, which are sort of these model-centric approaches which sort of have reified the abstractions. And that's something, another thing Whitehead critiqued, wasn't it? This idea of is the fallacy of misplaced concreteness.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. So, yeah, for Whitehead, it's always the concrete that explains the abstract. You can never explain the concrete with the abstract. You
yeah,
explain the abstract with the concrete, which is to say, it's our uh, concrete experience of being alive that is
hmm,
the final arbiter, and so the best we can hope to do is build analogies, from Whitehead's point of view, across different domains of our experience. And when we feel like we understand this one aspect of experience pretty well, we can then see if there are analogies to other domains of experience that we don't understand as well. And so when we're
mm,
making models, that's more or less what we're always doing. But
yeah,
model centrism is when we forget that that's what we're doing and we think that we can put our experience, our lived experience to the side, and somehow access this underlying, usually mechanical process that would
yeah,
explain our experience. And so that's making the abstractions more real than concrete experience. And it's not that models can't be helpful. It's not that there's a better way of doing science than coming up with a model and then kind of like throwing it up against reality and seeing if it breaks and how it breaks and then repairing it and trying again. And that's kind of the experimental method in science. And it works really well. But the problem is when that scientific method gets mistaken for a materialistic metaphysics, where all of a sudden we
mm,
think the model that we have today that happens to work well enough in the situations we've tested it out in is the truth, is the final reality that explains, whatever the phenomenon is we're trying to explain. And, you only have to look at the history of science for 5 seconds to see how many times we've made that mistake. um, and we have to stay, uh, mm, we have to hold our models lightly if we want science to advance. And
right.
Whitehead's suggestion is not, oh, let us not model, but instead, let us always be careful to avoid uh, mistaking the model for the reality. So
Sure.
mhm,
Almost jumping from like the epistemology to the ontology in a sense,
that's
just
right.
kind of assume, yeah. Um, Yeah, it's really interesting actually. I noticed this because I'm sort of making my way slowly through Schopenhauer's Willen representation, and he's maybe in a way sort of how Whitehead, sort of just there's a resonance. I don't know. When I first sort of encountered his ideas, they just drew me in, and so I thought, well, I'll give it a go. But one of the things he actually makes this criticism, and this is in what like I think like 1816 or something. But basically, the
Mhm.
people even at that point, he was saying, this idea of reifying the abstractions because he talks about abstract representation and sense representation. And even I think he actually might even go, it's like there are people right now who are suggesting that we can even that consciousness is essentially an abstraction, which we're seeing, today as well. It's almost like nothing's changed in a sense in 200 years, with things like epiphenomenalism, sort of illusionism, this idea that somehow consciousness is some just abstraction.
Right. Yeah, I think Schopenhauer is very Kantian in his thinking, but he's also uh, he's been exposed to Buddhism
Yeah,
and
the Upanishads.
recognizes mhm, um, there's this Buddhist concept of Trishna, which is craving, and so
Mm,
for Schopenhauer, the underlying metaphysical reality is will, and it's this just blind, irrational striving.
mm, mm,
And we human beings are often unconscious of that will because it's not personal. What we
mm,
experience is this sort of Kantian representational enclosure in terms of
yeah.
space and time and causality, um, and Schopenhauer seems to have been very pessimistic about the extent to which we could break through that illusion to come into touch with this underlying will. And then even if we did come into touch with that underlying will, uh, it's almost like we'd have to give up our consciousness. So it's like either we're conscious and under an illusion, or we're in touch with reality, but we're not conscious anymore. um,
Right.
and so, but there is a way in which Whitehead also recognizes a kind of cosmic will. He would call
Mm,
it divine eros,
okay.
eros, like desire.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And for Whitehead, it's he's not as pessimistic about this because he thinks it's precisely that desire that allowed the universe to evolve from simpler forms of experience into the self-conscious kind of experience that we have.
Mm.
And it may still be true that for us to directly, um, feel the non-human world, we have to let go of some of our egoic self-awareness. But
Mm.
at the same time, I think for Whitehead, there could be further evolutionary potentials that our species, human beings, are not the pinnacle of evolution, and our form of consciousness could, in fact, be just the platform for even more amazing forms of uh, complex super
As in,
consciousness.
as I said, what is it almost as though we're like neurons for a higher agent or something?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, that's it's really interesting that, yeah.
Hmm. Yeah.
Um,
So some similarities with Schopenhauer, but Schopenhauer's still working in that Kantian
yeah, yeah, for sure,
framework,
for
right?
sure.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, there's definitely a difference, and I think the difference, my understanding as well with Schopenhauer is more he did step away from, I suppose, where he moved beyond Kant in as so far as he said, no, we can know the noumenon in a sense. For example, will and it's it's what we experience, but essentially he was still saying, but our representation is merely a kind of we can never get beyond the representation in a sense, whereas and so there's still that kind of subject object dichotomy. Whereas my understanding with Whitehead as well, there's a slightly difference. I don't know if we could say there isn't, or you can't, he's not considering perception as in a subject and object, but more part whole, and that perception and causation are sort of one of the same. That there is no perception without causation. Um,
That's right.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Um, Whitehead still speaks in terms of subjects and objects, but he definitely, as you were saying, shifts into a Mariological way of thinking, just part whole
Yeah, yeah,
relationships,
yeah.
where what was a subject in one moment becomes an object for a new subject in the next moment. And there's a kind of nesting that occurs as the
Mm.
past accumulates. Every subsequent actual occasion or subject which arises is including what the subjects prior to it had experienced, but as objectified or under objectification, which is to say, what was subjectively immediate for that concrescence perishes and becomes objectively immortal and is felt by the next occasion of experience from its perspective. And so there's a transference of feeling. So like what you feel in one moment eventually becomes what I feel in the next moment if we're communicating. But I don't feel it
Mm.
exactly as you felt it. I feel it as I feel it from this point of view. But I'm still feeling
Yeah,
what
yeah,
were
yeah,
your feelings. So we're
yeah.
immersed in this network of feelings being transmitted, back and
Right.
forth. And the subject
Yeah.
object dichotomy is no longer one wherein there's like an enduring subject over here, separate from another enduring subject over here. And then there are other types of things called objects out in the environment that those subjects
Mm.
represent. It's not that picture anymore. That's the Cartesian Kantian
Yeah.
picture, but instead what we call subject and object is relative to our perspective, right? Moment by moment. So it's like throwing the subject object relation into process instead of imagining it spatially as like isolated subjects trying to represent isolated objects.
Mm. Yeah. And so basically one of the things I suppose about ontologies and these frameworks, and maybe one of the functions of philosophy, at least how I see it, is it can help make sense of and make perhaps more parsimonious accounts of empirical, just what we experience, data, which is what we're always doing. And you've spoken about this, for example, there'll often be, you see it in the sciences, maybe more in the hard sciences, but there are some people who are almost reticent, or sort of they repulse at the idea of metaphysics, forgetting that there is always metaphysics, that you can't get away from it. But one of the things when reading your readings on your writings on Whitehead, which to me I thought was really interesting, and help coming back to the idea of it helped me make sense out of things is so I work in mental health psychology, and I have a real interest in, I suppose, different theories, but what the main one I'm quite interested in is psychoanalysis. And there's this idea of transference, countertransference, which, for those who maybe aren't familiar, is this idea that we can kind of imbue the other with a feeling. And that can actually, there is emphasis on it happening sort of unconsciously, but that's by the by. The point is that when you're in you enter a relationship with someone, just an encounter, feelings somehow like channel across, there's this between us, but you don't even need to make sense out of that in a sort of a therapeutic way. You just have that anytime you're with someone, when you can be in a certain room and you get that feeling. And I think Whitehead's framework really helps make sense of it a lot. It's more sort of parsimonious and sort of makes sense of it to me anyway than a kind of mm, maybe like a predictive processing account, which would see it as somehow this like rational calculation, which happens sort of starts off unconsciously, and then somehow poof, you have this feeling.
Right. Right. So with the predictive processing models of consciousness and cognition, right? I think there's something there that's helpful and even could allow us to build artificial intelligence and artificial minds that
Mm,
mimic r- living organisms and even people to some extent, by engaging in, you know, not engaging in this attempt to internally mirror an objective reality, but instead just developing, yeah, these predictions about what's going to happen next, what you're going to perceive next, and bringing into alignment expectations with sensory inputs. And like that's a great way to build I think, a
mm,
very lifelike machine. But that's different from saying, oh, this is how we do it. Because like, again, it's model centrism to imagine that the brain is some kind of Bayesian calculator, that's constantly calculating, the and adjusting priors based on sensory inputs about what's most likely to happen next. I don't think that that's what's going on in a biological organism. You can model it that way, but it seems to me that it's not just that we're more complicated, it's that, there are so many examples of us, first of all, doing things that are not in our own interest, that are altruistic. And, you can explain that with group selection and all these other ways of thinking about what is selected for evolutionarily, and maybe not just my own individual survival, but the survival of the whole species. But regardless, we're not calculators. We're feeling creatures. And, what how I identify in any given moment depends very much on my relationships to other people. Sometimes I do identify as like just me, as this
Mm.
embodied individual. Other times I identify, with my romantic partner. We are a unit of some kind. Other
Right, right,
times
right.
it's like my family or my community, my tribe, whatever, my nation. And so we have these
Mm.
various levels of ways that we can feel with one another and become, in a sense, higher identities. And so I think the predictive processing approaches would want to explain that all in terms of something going on inside the skull. And I think that um, is just an unnecessary limitation of who and what we are to an arbitrary to sequester it within some arbitrary boundary. Um,
Yes.
yeah,
Yeah, and also because how would you say all of this, or not all of it, but a lot of it, yeah, it's situated in something bigger, to me anyway. And what I mean by that is there's, predictive processing being one example, it clearly it's a very effective way of making sense out of data. It has a lot of sort of explanatory power, predictive power, maybe when it comes to things like artificial intelligence and stuff. But it's when people end up making a jump, and I don't know if sometimes it happens almost just like, oops, we've made this jump to it sort of being this yeah, it's almost ontological, rather than just a framework to make sense out of a model. We forget, and this seems to be really prevalent within the kind of, again, this sort of zeitgeist we live in. And maybe it's changing, but definitely over perhaps the last sort of, I don't know how far you could go back, but at least 100 years. I don't know. Some people whether you'd cut the boundary, whether it start with logical positivism. I don't know how far you go back to the Enlightenment. I don't know. Um, but yeah, this sort of model centrism, and people not even realizing that's what's happening, and that's why I love the what is it, the misplaced concreteness fallacy.
yeah.
The other
Hmm.
one is the genetic fallacy. I don't know if that was necessarily Whitehead who actually articulated that, but that's another one I think is really good because okay, all of this where I'm getting right is what I like about philosophy and people like yourself and how you utilize philosophy is bringing to bear upon how this sort of like reflexivity which it sort of imposes upon people to go, oh, hang on, oh yeah, we're doing this, we didn't even realize it. For example, when people
Hmm.
say things like, oh, rationality, it's cold, there's no emotion there, there's no, we're just doing it. We don't care about the actual what's going on behind things. We're grown up, we're not scared of the dark. Not that, okay, maybe not, that's not even the scared of the dark pit, because that you don't even need to go into the sort of theological side of things, but just that somehow. And I think Nietzsche was very aware of this, this kind of, and that's one of the things I like about Nietzsche, albeit I don't agree with all of it, but this sort of, his the will to power. And I think we see that in a lot of the time in, sciences and stuff. And actually, again, I found the quote from one of your articles, but which was a Whitehead quote about there's something curious. This is not verbatim, but there's something curious about scientists, with whose purpose is to like basically
Mm.
describe how there is no purpose.
Yeah, it's scientists animated by the purpose of proving that they are purposeless constitute an interesting subject of study.
Right. Right, right, right. Yeah, yeah. It's a great quote. And I suppose I'll stop talking. And I suppose this is all maybe beckoning a question, which is that for you what one of the main things as much as the philosophies for oneself and can help, and even saying that though, given what we've been talking about, oneself is never one's not
Mm.
isolated from the world that they inhabit and what they're becoming and stuff, and as well as others. But is that one of the things you like about philosophy, is that it does sort of, you can use it and help people perhaps, or encourage dialogues, and for people to be more reflexive about the things they're saying?
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's recognizing that we're, wearing glasses, taking off the glasses and seeing what the world looks like without them.
mm,
and maybe it's blurry at first. I mean, the whole Platonic myth, the story that Plato tells in the Republic about the allegory of the cave,
mm,
that we are essentially chained to the floor in deep in the bowels of a dark cavern, and most of what we take to be reality are just shadows projected on the cave wall.
mm,
And I think nowadays with social media and the way in which artificial intelligence and these algorithms are able to manipulate our opinions by showing us certain um, perspectives and not showing us other perspectives on all the screens that we're constantly staring at all day. Uh, Plato's allegory of the cave it's so prescient. The digital media environment that we live in is exactly what he was foreseeing already thousands of years ago. And
mhm.
philosophy's role is, to help us begin to turn around. What
Yeah.
is the source of the light that we're seeing reflected, or that's forming these shadows on the wall in front of us? Like, so, the first level of this is to ask, well, who's producing all of this media? Okay, it's these five major corporations. Okay, interesting. But then you have to go a layer deeper than that. And I think philosophy can help us do that kind of social and cultural and political and economic critique,
Mm,
to recognize the powers that are shaping our perspectives and opinions. But then
mm,
I think there's an even deeper layer here, and this is also reflected in Plato's allegory of the cave. Like there's this first layer where you turn around and you see, oh, still inside the cave, there's a fire behind these elites who are holding up, these puppets that are projecting the shadows onto the wall. But you could go further towards the truth than even that layer. Like you can actually get out of the cave and see the sunlight and be in the
mm,
real world. Um, and so
yes.
I think a lot of people, in some sense justified and rightfully so, really they devote themselves to the social and political critique, recognizing the injustices in society. But then there's this also, in addition to that, this deeper reality of the soul and the spirit. Um, there's the fact that, each of us is going to die one day. And as Plato has Socrates say in his dialogue Phaedo, which is depicted right above me,
Mm,
uh, philosophy is preparation for dying, right? And we want to become aware of the immortality of the soul, whatever that
mm,
might mean. And that's a whole long conversation. But we want to become aware of that. Philosophy affords us an opportunity to become aware of that before we die.
yes.
And that, I think, is the passageway toward a kind of deep truth that might even be eternal. And that's the promise of philosophy. It's a journey. I don't know that we ever finally arrive at that truth, but
Mm,
there's a source to the light of our own consciousness. And so trying to turn our attention to the source of our attention,
mm,
that reflexive maneuver is the, I think, primary method of philosophy. And we're never done turning around to try to catch ourselves in the act of
mm,
producing this display that we call reality, and getting to the bottom of that mystery is at least a lifetime's worth of work and play, I should say. I do think there's a lot of joy in this process, but
yeah.
yeah, that's kind of how I see
Yeah.
it.
Yeah, that's a really nice way of putting it. And yeah, I mean, there's a two kind of ways I can see this conversation go, but one of them is yeah, it's what you're talking about, like looking backwards and this kind of idea of like where the source of the light and dying and how, I think I've said it before in a conversation with someone, but that's what I like
Excuse me.
about the yes, yeah, bless you, that's right. Um, you okay? Yeah.
Yep.
Um, all right, great. Yeah, these I mean, it's I mean, this maxim, if we can call it, I don't know, maxim, but this sort of sentiment, it's in the. I also like the Upanishads, um, and I'm not a theologian, but I like to sort of dabble in like some kind of like Christian sort of ideas and stuff. But St. Francis of Assisi, he said it is by dying we find eternal life. And it just reminds me of that. And there is this kind of like throughout all the traditions, this idea of like dying by dying. And actually, Whitehead even talks about this again through reading you, but this idea of like we must die, like each actual occasion almost must like die to fulfill itself almost. And I thought there was some kind of interesting resonance there. Um,
Hmm. Yeah.
um, yeah.
There's this doctrine of reincarnation. Most people associate it with Eastern Asian religions, but there's a version of it in Judaism. The early Christians believed in it. The Pythagoreans believed in it, so it's actually quite widespread
Mm,
across East and West. It's only more modern Western cultures that have denied reincarnation. Both eventually the church denied it. There's only this one life, and either you die, you either go to heaven or hell, and that's it. And secular, materialist cultures similarly say, well, you die and the lights just go out. Um, but reincarnation can be understood in so many different ways, and I think Whitehead's ontology of these arising and perishing actual occasions is one way that we can make sense of this process of reincarnation. Because as you're saying, an actual occasion, in order to affect the future, has to die to itself in the present and give
mm,
itself to that future in the hopes that the next occasion of experience will take up its corpse in a sense and make something of it, feed on it in
yeah.
a way. And then that makes it
Yeah.
sound kind of gnarly and dark. But the idea is that we're dying and being reborn moment by moment by moment, right? And what we leave behind, you could say, is karma. The results of our actions, the results of our decision in the present ripple
Mm,
out into the future, right? And
mm,
so we do have responsibility for what happens in the future, even though we die in each moment. But what we leave behind is the ground out of which the next moment will arise,
right.
right? And so, in some sense, Whitehead's ontology of these um, creative processes inheriting from one another and creatively advancing an account of reincarnation just taking
Yeah.
place
Yeah.
um, sort of microcosmically. And it could also be something that takes place at the level of, you know, um, human souls. But I mean, one would expect that if Whitehead's ontology is getting at something real, then it would occur at these different levels. But
Mm.
yeah.
Yeah, I literally wrote that down as pretty much what you said with this idea of like his concrecence implying that having to die to the present, the next moment, sounding like almost Satori in sort of Zen Buddhism. But then my question was, and I've sort of converged on this or kind of come around this idea myself before. It's like not necessarily in regards to the kind of Whiteheadian approach or making sense out of it, but and maybe I'm wondering then from a Whiteheadian perspective, how would that make, what would he answer, or a Whiteheadian, how would they answer it? What continuity is there in an ontological sense? For example, like let's say consciousness, is the awareness which moves, almost across those events or something, is that almost pure subjectivity? Does that change? Does that change? Does that remain the same? And it's just the kind of contents which have changed. I don't know if that even makes sense, but that's kind of how I've thought. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think you're asking, is it continuous or is it discrete, right?
Essentially, yeah.
Yeah. And that's a it's a very difficult question because Whitehead does um, articulate what he calls a kind of atomism, but when he uses the term
Mm,
atomism, he's not talking about again like little bits of material stuff or particles. Atom
mm,
from the Greek literally means atomos literally means uncuttable.
right.
It means undivided,
Mm,
um, which you know um, the atomists and Newton and other materialist scientists use that term to refer to a particle that sort of is eternally fixed and doesn't change, and like that's the basis of all reality. But Whitehead's using the phrase to mean something different, more to mean the opposite of a part. He's talking about a whole, something undivided. And so
Mm,
these moments of experience, these actual occasions, are um, undivided wholes, and each one arises and perishes, and is a unit of value, and is
mm,
unique in all world history. There's never been the universe has never had a perspective on itself just like this one, right?
mm,
And so there's something very important for Whitehead about the individuality of each actual occasion. And yet, as they arise and perish, they create this stream of, in our case, as conscious human beings, a stream of consciousness, which
mm,
feels unbroken, which feels continuous. And
right.
in some sense, it is because these occasions, as they arise and perish, are dying into each other. And the transition is seamless in a way, even though there's also a decision occurring moment by moment about how to transmit what one has felt into the future. And so
Mm,
this gets kind of paradoxical and difficult to articulate, but there's both a continuity and a discontinuity. And there has
mm,
to be a little bit of discontinuity, otherwise we couldn't change. We couldn't have creative freedom to do something different in the next moment than we did in the prior moment, right?
right.
And so, in an effort to preserve individuality and the possibility of decision,
Mm,
Whitehead wants to understand these actual occasions of experience as occurring like unified drops, right? Even though they then melt into each other. Um,
yeah.
yeah,
And so that, and then just on this point with Whitehead, he I don't know if he uses if he refers to free will, but in a sense he sort of implies it because he talks about, which I think he brings back from Aristotle, which maybe got forgotten about, or in the from following the Enlightenment, basically the final cause, final causation, as opposed to mere is it sufficient causation,
yeah,
or is that what? Yeah,
efficient.
efficient causation. So essentially, yes, the each moment is efficiently caused through the concrecence, or the previous events. And in a way, there's something really interesting about that, because then you suggest in some sense every occasion is imbued, or is the history of, and that's where almost that interesting evolutionary parallel, in the same way we
Yeah,
sort of kind of inherit our, the lineage going back like eons, in the same way that kind of metaphysically, in a sense, or somehow that's happening. But sorry, yeah, so essentially, but what he suggests, so sorry, is that it's not so. Why don't you, sorry, talk on what's meant by the efficient causation and the final causation, and what does
mm.
that? What are the implications of that? What does that actually mean?
Yeah. So Whitehead says that historically, say in the medieval period and during the scholastic period in Europe, there was an overemphasis on final causality derived from Aristotle's cosmology. And then with the scientific revolution and the rise of this mechanistic philosophy, there was an overemphasis on efficient causality. And so, what are these forms of causality? Um, Final causality has to do with purpose. It has to do with aim. There's a way in which, like for Aristotle, heavy bodies fall towards the earth because they want to be closer to the earth, right? That's a final cause, an explanation of what gravitation, as we refer to it now, in terms of a final cause. Whereas Newton wanted to understand gravitation um, without making reference to any purpose. Um, and the mechanistic philosophy, which Newton wasn't totally mechanistic. I should clarify because he still allowed for action at a distance, spooky action at a distance, as Einstein would later refer to it.
Mm,
And that's not mechanistic. That's actually, for Newton, what kept the planets in their orbits was God reaching in and pushing them. That's an efficient cause as well, but it's a kind of mysterious theological type of efficient cause. Anyways, most mechanistic thinkers imagine that the entirety of the material world can be explained by reference to efficient causes alone, which means pushes from behind,
right.
force, you know. particles banging into each other and accidentally taking certain forms and taking certain shapes. Now, of course, physics would refer to, even mechanistic physics would refer to these laws of physics, which are not efficient causes. These are, it's hard to account for where a law of physics comes from in a purely mechanistic or materialistic ontology. And so there's already a bit of extra ingredients here than just matter. And
Mm.
whenever I talk to a materialist physicist, I'm like, so tell me about the origin of these laws of yours. And they're just like, well, they're they want to, on the one hand, say, well, that's just abstractions that human beings come up with to explain in general how matter behaves. But then that becomes merely epistemological and like, well, isn't there a real physical world out there? And why should it behave so regularly? Anyways,
Mm.
um, efficient causes are just these mechanical collisions, right? And mechanical forces. And so what Whitehead says is, look, the scholastics deriving their thinking from Aristotle were overemphasizing final causes. Um, and the mechanistic philosophers and the first scientists, they were overemphasizing efficient causes. What we need is to find the proper balance here. And so in the process of concrescence, the efficient cause is the way in which the past is inherited or prehended by each occasion of experience. And for the most part, there's a conformal relationship, which is to say, each new arising occasion is going to feel what was felt in the just prior moment. And that's a
Mm.
transference of feeling. And as you were saying earlier, for Whitehead, perception or feeling and causation are the same thing. That's what prehension is basically, that concept that Whitehead invents this term for, is meant to combine or synthesize our understanding of perception or feeling with our understanding of causation, so that instead of talking about cause and effect, we would say, well, it's really cause and affect. Um,
Mm.
and so that's his version of the efficient cause. It's feeling what was felt in the past and conforming with it to some degree.
Yeah.
Final causation then is, in the process of concrescence, there's actually two poles. There's the physical pole, which is what I've just been describing, the confirmation to the past, and then the mental pole, which is where final causation and aim and purpose come in, because an occasion is not just determined by its past. It feels not only what has already occurred, but what could occur in light of that
Mm.
past. And so
Mm.
Whitehead has these two kinds of prehension. There's physical prehension, which again is a kind of efficient cause, and then there's conceptual prehension, which can draw upon alternative possibilities that haven't yet occurred in the past. Um, and so, Whitehead's ontology is dipolar, you could say. There's actuality and then there's also possibility. They're not
Yeah.
in separate domains. They always exist in varying degrees, integrated with one another, but there's always
Mm.
something held in reserve. There's an infinite array of alternatives available in each moment for an actual occasion to consider when it tries to arrive at a decision about how to inherit its past, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and so the final cause is, well, what are the alternatives that we can draw in to interpret and adjust what we're feeling in the past so as to arrive at a unified perspective? It's depending on the grade of the occasion, either more or less dominated by its physical pole. So lower grade occasions of experience, say in the non-biological world, are more dominated by efficient causes from the past. They're more repetitive.
Right.
Whereas living organisms and higher mammals and human beings, we have the capacity to ingress more possibility, to feel more of these alternatives, and so to do something
Mm.
different, to aim at something other than what has already occurred, right?
Yeah.
So this is how Whitehead tries to balance these two types of causation.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really interesting. Goethe is someone you have evidently read because you've written on him. Um, and I know you have I don't know where I read it, but you obviously have an affinity. Well, it's clear you have an affinity towards German thinkers to the point I
Mhm.
think you have practiced or are practicing learning. We're trying to learn to speak German, I think.
Mhm.
Yeah, it is amazing actually. I was talking to someone else. It might have been Peter who I was talking to about this. I mean, yeah, Germany have produced a wonderful heritage of thought there, from at least from, I suppose I can only speak for myself, but I think you would concur, but from the idealists, but also actually maybe from a psychology background. Obviously there's like Jung, um Freud, they wrote in German. I'm pretty sure they wrote in German. um yeah
Mhm.
but anyway, Goethe, yeah, so because I suppose traditionally, maybe when people have a fleeting impression of Goethe, they see him as, as the poet. He was an essayist, or he wrote letters and, literature essentially. However, which you've touched on, he actually also, well, he had scientific. He engaged in scientific sort of endeavors. Um, and maybe as well sort of philosophically sort of like questioning, and he because well, essentially he critiqued the kind of scientific methodology, didn't he? So yeah,
Mhm.
what have you mainly take from Goethe? What have your kind of, yeah, what's your main takes from Goethe been, and how has he sort of, yeah, shaped how you see things maybe?
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting that though he's known as a poet and a writer, and some people also know that he was the privy counselor to the Duke of Weimar, Duke Karl August, for many years. So he was a statesman, but not as many people know that he was a scientist. And actually, when Goethe reflected on his contributions, he felt like the most important thing that he did was develop a theory of color, um, to rival Newton's approach to this to the understanding of color. He worked on theories of plant metamorphosis and um, bone morphology, and he was very interested in geology. And um, he was less of a philosopher and was constantly seeking out help from philosophers to understand his own method, actually. Um,
Right.
he became quite good friends with Friedrich Schiller, who was a playwright, but also a philosopher who studied Kant's aesthetic theory very deeply. And
Mm,
um, Goethe would say, "Look, when I observe plants through their processes of growth and formation, I'm seeing an archetype.
yeah.
I'm seeing a form that is alive and helping to guide that process of formation." And Schiller, as a good Kantian, would say, no, you're not seeing that form. That form is in an idea in your mind, that you're seeing through to help you interpret the plant out there. And um, Goethe said, no, I don't think so, and tried to develop his own participatory epistemology, would be a word for it, where
Right.
he wanted to understand the human mind a bit like Aristotle had understood it, as being capable of taking on the forms of the things in the world. So that when Goethe knows the plant at the level of the archetype that is informing its growth, that same archetype at work in the plant is coming to life in his imagination, in his mind, right? And so there's a participation through this process of knowing in the same
That's
archetype.
so interesting. That's so interesting. Sorry, it just makes me think of Jung and the Logos, and how um that and the archetypes in the sense of like how and synchronicity, and how it is that we, yeah, have synchronicity, because essentially, um yeah, sorry, I'm just thinking out loud. Sometimes I do this, I think out loud.
It's
But yeah,
okay. So do I.
um yeah. um but yeah, so you're, sorry, please carry on. Yeah, you're talking about, yeah, the archetypal patterns, and universals, and how they sort of converge. But essentially, what you're saying? They converge sort of, if we think of a pole physically, but then also the kind of archetype of the idea at the same time.
Right. Right. So basically, Goethe is trying to develop a scientific method whereby we could perceive formal causes,
Mm,
which is another kind of causality. There's four that Aristotle enumerates. There's a material cause, what is a thing made of? The efficient
mm,
cause, which is this sort of force pushing things. Um, the final cause, which is the purpose towards which a thing is moving. And the formal cause is in reference to the kind of archetype that gives shape and direction to processes of growth. Um, and so Goethe wanted to bring formal causes back into science, you could say. And in a way,
Hmm.
when I made reference earlier to the strange position of laws of physics in a materialist cosmology, laws of physics are kind of like formal causes. But because a materialist ontology can't explicitly acknowledge that, they end up with this problem on their hands, like where do the laws of physics come from if it's all just
Right,
efficient
right,
causing.
right.
And so Goethe is saying, well, there is, a real physical world out there, and participating in physical processes are these archetypes, these forms,
Yeah.
which are intelligent and which have some kind of agency. And so Goethe would understand the growth process of plants in terms of these two uh, opposing forces. There's the inner archetypal power of the plant, which wants to take on a particular form, but then there's also these environmental conditions which are going to constrain the plant's ability to take on that form with any degree of perfection,
Right,
right? And so
right.
depending on the climate, depending on the altitude, depending on the soil quality,
Oh, that's
the
so
same
interesting.
the same species of plant driven by the same archetype is going to manifest differently, right?
Right.
There's environmental conditions and the archetypal powers meet, and what we see as the plant is a product of that synthesis.
Mm.
Um,
Sorry. Yeah.
and so, Goethe's developing a form of science that would be, and a method for doing science that would overcome this dualism and bifurcation of nature, to use Whitehead's terms, um, that would separate the observing scientist from the phenomena that they are trying to observe, and instead say there's a kind of circuit of perception here, and that the forms I consider in my imagination are the same forms that are at work in the living beings whose processes of growth I'm trying to understand, right? And so he also applied the same method to bone morphology. And just as he would say, if you study the growth of a plant according to this method, you will see, as he put it, that all is leaf. Now, he doesn't mean that every part of the plant is like uh, a leaf folded differently on itself. What he means is that there's an underlying um, archetypal power that one of its simplest forms is the leaf. But if you watch the process of growth of a plant, what begin as leaves eventually become petals on a flower, and so there's a metamorphosis of a simple form through a series of variations.
Mm.
He would turn that same logic onto the vertebrate body, and say all is vertebrate. All of the bones of our body are metamorphosed vertebral bones, right?
Right.
That either expand or contract or turn inside out. You have to think kind of topologically here.
Hmm.
But he would say if you watch the process of embryogenesis, you can see this happening, that there's one
Hmm.
underlying form um, that manifests in all of this variety, right? But that, our skull uh, down to our leg bones and our limb bones is a variation upon a theme, right? Of what constructs the bones that
Mm.
construct our spinal cord. And so, it's a fruitful method that has been carried forward by some alternative scientists.
Mike, not Mike Levin, no?
I think there's something Goethean about what Mike Levin is doing, but he uses a very different type of language, a more computational language, because
Okay,
that's
okay.
what how biologists speak nowadays. But I think
Mm.
we could translate what he's discovering about these bioelectric fields
Mm.
that guide the growth of organisms into Goethe's terms, and think about those fields
Right.
as archetypal patterns.
Yeah. Who, sorry, because I suggest, who were you going to say any names, or you're just saying there are just people nowadays who are
I would point
fresh?
people to Craig Holdridge, who's
Okay.
in upstate New York at a place called the Nature Institute.
Yeah.
Um, and if anyone just Google Goethean science and Goethean approaches to biology, and you'll find there are many books where trained biologists take this approach and understand evolution in a way that's, I think, compatible with Darwin, but deeper. And
Mm,
Darwin actually acknowledges how influential Goethe was for him in the origin of species. And so, in some
mm,
ways, Goethe's approach to these questions inspired Darwin to develop evolutionary theory. Um, and so Darwin was uh, more of a holistic thinker than, say, the neo-Darwinians who focus more on genetics in the 20th century
yeah.
are.
And this is very interesting. It to me, it's makes me think of who I know you're familiar with, McGilchrist, and in this way, it's this sort of hemispheric difference. Almost it's right hemispheric in the sense of it's allowing this sort of idea of presencing, this idea of allowing like what is to come into presence more, as opposed to this. And I think this is what you said Goethe was critical of, this more left hemispheric approach, which was sort of quick to want to, articulate a model, perhaps driven by some sort of sense of power or to control, and in doing that, science sort of cut its legs off and sort of allow sort of realizing what its potential might be, and in really sort of allowing nature to reveal itself. We've actually just sort of quite precociously said, this is how nature is, and yeah, got lost in that.
Right. Hmm. Yeah, I think that hemispheric difference is a helpful way of noticing these different temperaments, different attitudes,
Mm.
different ways of attending to the world, as Ian McGilchrist would say. Um, and Goethe was definitely right-brained, uh,
Yeah.
to put it simply. Um, and I think that's not to say that there isn't a rigorous and logical way of explaining his method that a left hemisphere dominant person or personality would be able to digest and understand. Um, and I think Goethe really needs that sort of philosophical help because again, he wasn't very good at describing what he was doing in conceptual terms or in
Right.
philosophical terms. He just did it. He just had this intuitive capacity to see organic form at work in nature.
Mm.
And he actually turned to Schelling. They were Schelling was, a generation younger, um, but quite bright. And Schelling, was already a professor at the University of Jena when he was 23 years old. Because Goethe thought he was such a genius, Goethe had him appointed. And Schelling's philosophy of nature was helpful to Goethe so that he could really understand, yeah, kind of like what are the conditions that make possible this type of science that I'm doing? How is it that I can see intuitively into the archetypal processes of the living world? Schelling's cosmology helped him come to terms with that in a way. So he needed the help of philosophers and still does, I think.
That's so. Do you know what this just made me think of? It's made me think, sorry, of Goethe almost being a kind of an almost like Jung, but whereas Jung was very introverted, Goethe was saying is quite extroverted in that he was noticing the archetypes as they manifested in a sense in the world, whereas Jung was very much sort of like, I think he went into himself very much.
Yeah. You
Yeah,
could say Jung was doing a kind of like what Goethe was doing with plants and animals and color in the natural world. Jung was doing to his own psyche,
yeah.
right? He turned that same kind of intuitive perception inward.
Mm.
Um,
So I'm mindful of the time. What time do you want to finish by?
I've got about 10 more minutes. I do have to go
Great.
to
That's
another meeting then, but yeah.
yeah, of course. Yeah, brilliant. So maybe then sort of finishing things off. Um, hmm. Okay, so when you've spoken about talking and conversing with materialists and stuff, are you do you feel confident? And do you think we can ever be truly confident in a metaphysics, if that makes sense? So you know how, for example, some people, they might be staunchly materialist and they'll shoot down anything that's contrarian to it or not in alignment with it. Do you think, I suppose I'll ask you, yeah, do you, I mean, are you at a point whereby you feel confident in being able to look at certain metaphysics and go, yeah, I think given how nature is revealing itself, that just doesn't seem like it can be. Yeah.
I mean, I think I'm confident that there are better and worse metaphysical schemes.
Yeah.
We can, and how do you judge that? Well, it's um, the extent to which your metaphysics needs to explain away inconvenient phenomena that don't fit into the abstractions that you've devised. Um, that's a signal that there's some inadequacy in your
Mm.
basic categories. And so that said, I wouldn't ever want to claim that this is it. We have found the true
Yeah,
metaphysics, and
sure.
it's finished, and there's no more to know. Um,
Well, and Whitehead was, in fact, Whitehead was quite sort of staunch on that, wasn't he? In the sense of like, we can't, even though he put forward a theory, wasn't he quite hot on sort of saying, but we must not fall prey to sort of dogma.
yeah, no, absolutely. He develops a method of doing speculative philosophy that's systematic but open-ended,
Yes,
right?
yes.
Um, and he exemplifies that in Process and Reality, his magnum opus, by about 250 pages into the book. He abolishes one of his own categories and said, "Oh, turns out we don't need that one. There's another one that
Right, right, right.
encompasses, you know, uh, that does the work of this category I thought we needed." And so, he's adjusting his own system on the fly
Yep.
as an invitation to those of us who would take up his work later to continue that constructive effort,
Mm,
and to never delude ourselves with the impression that we finally completed the
mm.
system. Yeah. So,
Yeah, makes sense.
mhm.
And do you, for example, then, okay, let's say you were conversing with someone who's like, not even if you're conversing, when you look at something, say like naive realism, are you given, they advance with what scientific sort of findings, they've, look at like quantum physics and stuff, and even without that, maybe just thinking, logic using reason philosophically, that something like naive realism is essentially doesn't make much sense now. Do you feel like, yeah,
Hmm. Well, I mean, naive realism, sure, but Whitehead referred to his philosophy as organic realism.
okay,
Um, and so I think, there are some, I try to be respectful of everyone's positions
right,
because, smart people tend to have good reasons for believing things.
yeah,
And I really enjoy speaking with scientists more than philosophers typically,
okay,
because I want to learn from scientists. I mean, I could learn from philosophers too, um, but I try to be in that position of yeah, humility to learn what the discipline that scientist is coming out of, what it has to offer,
sure,
because
sure,
they have some body of evidence, and they have some theoretical interpretations of that evidence, and it could be
yeah,
that me as a philosopher, like, I'm especially interested in the evidence, and I want to hear their theoretical interpretations, but it could be
mm,
that, as a philosopher, I can step back and say, okay, it could be that the either the evidence that you have uh, may be interpreted in different ways you haven't considered, or it may be that the theoretical interpretation you have is actually constraining what counts as evidence for you.
mm,
You're not seeing a lot of the data because it doesn't appear through that theoretical framework.
yeah,
And so, as a philosopher, it's important to recognize that sometimes uh, mistaken interpretations of the facts enter the historical record just as facts. But
yeah,
if you were
yeah,
to go
yeah,
back with a different theory, a different way of looking, all of a sudden that fact is not what you thought. Um,
yeah,
you know, uh, like, it's a fact that from our point of view on the Earth, it looks like planets make this retrograde motion over the course of a year. Uh, and for Ptolemy and the pre-Copernican astronomers, that fact was interpreted as, oh, there must be some kind of epicycles going on up there, right? But it turns out that's a one way of interpreting the observed
Mm,
fact, and there are many other ways of theoretically interpreting that fact. Um,
sure.
and that happens, there were good reasons for chemists to imagine phlogiston when they were doing their experiments. But then there were some refinements and new concepts were developed, and now we don't speak in those terms anymore. But
Mm,
that's the nature of science. We're always laying a theoretical framework between us, or a model between us and what's observed. And that
mm,
framework both makes more observable and also less observable in different ways. And so
mm,
that's why it's so important to not mistake the theory, the model for the reality, right? It's just a lens through which we're looking.
mm. Yeah, nice. And I think that's quite a nice way to yeah, end.
Cool. Well, yeah, great questions, George. I really enjoyed exploring all these ideas with you. And yeah, could always do a part two at some point if you want. But
Yeah, 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 I'd love to whenever you have time because I know how busy you are, but that'd be brilliant. Yeah, I really enjoyed the conversation. Um, yeah, really enjoyed it. So yeah, and I will yeah, I will for those who've got to this point, I will link footnotes to Plato. Is it .com? Well, I'll link it anyway.
Mhm.
Yeah, which is Matt's website where you have your like your essays, your sort of academic essays, but then also the kind of like more bloggy type thing. Is that fair to say?
That's right. Yep.
Yeah. Yeah,
That's the
and
hub.
then also, yeah, and also you have written some books as well, which I'll link as well for people if they're interested.
Yep. Thank you. Yeah, thanks, George.
All right, Matt. Well, you have a lovely rest of your day.
Likewise. Have a good night and
All right,
see
Matt.
you around.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks.